Cities can't run on deficits. Cuts need to be made. So what's on the chopping block? What's the impact on housing? What's the impact on the TTC, the Gardner, and the DVP? Is there going to be a new sales tax? Join me as I talk to Budget Chief, Shelley Carroll. All right, we've got a budget deficit. So, Shelley, what programs are being cut? What's on the chopping block?
Well, if you look at the way we set targets, everyone's taking a cut. Everyone. We have a deficit of $1.5 billion. We have this wonderful new deal from the province, but it's mostly on the capital side. So on the operating side, just asking departments to flatline in this economy is a cut. So really, everyone's trimming away, trying to protect services at the ground level, but you set out to do that, but we may not be able to protect absolutely every service. We still have real challenges, post-pandemic impacts that are requiring us to be really tough on everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, Toronto's a huge city, $1.5 billion deficit, housing.
Yeah.
Transportation, TTC, public transportation, the Gardner, the DVP.
Yeah.
How are these being impacted?
Well, the province has agreed to upload those highways, but the fact that we have been maintaining to the tune of over $1 billion a year up until now means A, they're in pretty good shape as we hand them over, but it means that has been the vortex into which all capital dollars flow for a long time, the Gardner and the DVP ongoing. And so they've been lifted from us, but it's going to take us 2 or 3 years to really feel the benefit and the impact of having them off the books, but we will. And so it's a tremendous thing. We're tremendously grateful, but it still means that we have with us the burden of the TTC having a post-pandemic work from home ridership, which may be the permanent state. We may be struggling for a long time with the changing work habits. And so we have to sort of rethink how we collect fares. Maybe the monthly Metro Pass no longer makes sense. So what does that mean? And in the meantime, while we're waiting to do that, we're trying to run the full service on the transit system. And so we put in what we usually put in, the fare box pays what it usually pays, and then we hand over another $300 million a year in property taxes to be able to run that full service.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing that's also so interesting, a lot of the people who use the TTC, Toronto Transit Commission, don't always live in Toronto. So this is kind of a question of like, well, how do people pay into it? And how do people support it, right? So I think that's very, very interesting. What about housing? We've got a housing crisis.
We do. And it's not all government to blame. We're now in a situation that happens anytime you have a slowing economy. Developers stop building. They're not sure who's the market for this thing when it's done. If they have any empty units in already built buildings, they get nervous. Interest rates go up, that makes them nervous. Building supply costs go up, they get very nervous. Because then the problem is you put the shovel in the ground, but you don't know how much this is going to cost to do until you're in the third year of building and putting in the fridges and stoves. And so starts have slowed down. And so for governments, you can put together all the nifty incentives in the world. Is it enough to make people actually pick up a building permit and build? So we've started in the city of Toronto a very interesting thing. We're going back to where we were in the 70s. Our new mayor, Olivia Chow's plan is to be a public builder. We may only start with a couple of buildings, but it means that something is starting. Yeah. But it's going to require upfront cash.
But we also know building homes takes time. It takes labor, it takes materials, but ultimately it takes time to build these buildings. And we don't have enough units to house all the people who need it right now. So what's the interim solution?
Well, you know what? I'm not so sure that's true.
Okay.
We're at a place where we have builders saying they don't want to build, and there's a bit of a whisper campaign. People are starting to admit that they have unsold units. Well, what's the price on that unit? You set the price right, it'll be sold real fast.
Right.
And so we're in a market adjustment phase right now where are condos hot? Are single family dwellings hot? What's going on here? And so they could help us a lot with that. The other thing is, loosening up on what people can do on their properties.
Yeah.
When you're looking at a home, say you're purchasing a home new, people are now starting to look at, okay, and what is the life of this property? Is there space on it if one day I do want to build a garden suite? If you're on it now, can you build one right now? Well, again, those interest rates and building materials make you a bit nervous to launch into a renovation and build a unit. So we've got all of these things on the table, but the economy is making those incentives a little less effective. And so what we really have to look at is really making the case to the other orders of government. Do we need to beef up the incentives? Because the one thing we can build fast, sadly, is a shelter. We don't want to fill this city with shelters. We want to fill it with housing supply. We can do modular housing and set people up in a supportive housing situation in the span of about 3 months. If the funding and the site is there, it's a miracle in terms of how you build. But we don't want to keep building for the shelter population we have right now. We want to address these needs so we can get back down to what is normal in a city our size.
What would be normal in a city our size?
Well, we always account for having people who are maybe going to be in and out of the shelter system to the tune of about 5,000. You also want to have between 500 and 1,000 units that are ready to flex for a surprise refugee population or asylum seeking population. We're now at a point, so that would be a total of 6,000. We're now at a point where it's 10,500 and counting. 50% of the people in it are refugee claimants and asylum seekers. And so if you look at that math, we're actually doing pretty good in terms of people who are already here moving out into housing. We've been doing our best. We put a couple of hundred people out into houses and out of the shelter system in a supportive way a month, but 500 or 700 roll in.
Yeah.
And so we're losing the battle.
Yeah.
So what we want is more flex space so that we could handle this influx while we have it, but then hopefully get the housing supply back down to where we're putting people quickly into housing. You don't want people to stay in the shelter system for a long time. The longer they stay in the system, the less capacity they have to now make the leap into housing.
Yeah, no, and that's so true, because when we think about the refugee and asylum seekers who are out in front of on Peter Street, then being taken in by churches and then spreading out to other churches, like it's not sustainable, right? Like, I mean, Toronto is so wonderful because so many Torontonians that I meet are always willing to say, what can I do to help? And how do we help in a constructive way, right? So even if it's temporary solution or the out of cold system, all of those things are helpful, but it's not sustainable for a long-term base.
And currently, that's one of the things that's siphoning dollars away from everything else we do in the city. If we go back to pre-pandemic, you go back to, say, the 2018 budget of the shelter system was just under $200 million for the city. And then the province propped us up with provincial funds on a per diem basis per bed. They would help us with the cost of sheltering people. Their contribution has stayed the same, but we haven't really had the same luck with the federal government. Right. And so in terms of property tax dollars, we're now putting an additional $500 million in.
On top of the $200 million.
Yeah.
So that's $700 million.
Shelter budget is now $707 million on the city side.
Wow.
And growing.
Yeah. And that's the question. Who's not showing up at the table?
Yeah. And that's the thing. The provincial government has stayed about the same. And that's helpful because that provides some base system. But should they be asked to top that up? They're actually putting money on the table right now. They're willing to put more on. Part of the New Deal is they've said, we can give you an extra $200 million a year for the next 3 years to see if you can address this situation. But we're making it conditional on the federal government coming to the table because that's who ultimately should be at the table.
How do we make that happen?
Well, I'm optimistic. As I sit here today, the federal government is deep in conversation with the mayor and our staff and saying, we need to know for sure that it's them. We need the data to know that the reason your shelter system is growing is the federal influx. Is that who's in there? Mm-hmm. Every one of us knows that's who's in there because we see them sit on the street before we jam them into the system because it's very hard to get the intake in. But recently, we've collected the data to look at the growth week by week of the shelter system. Absolutely matches, if you graph it, the growth of asylum seekers and refugee claimants that have entered Ontario and Toronto. You could layer them one on top of the other in overhead slides, and it's exactly the same graph. So it stands to reason that's where this growth is coming from. Even if you didn't step inside one of these churches and see these people, you would know just looking at the data. And so we just recently put that in their hands, and we're hoping that they want to end this year by owning up to that, putting in the $250 million that would help us to address. We'd have a proper reception center. Because that's the other thing. Yeah. You don't want to sprinkle them throughout the general shelter population. You want them in a short-term circumstance and quickly get them into employment and housing so that they can be very productive, because many of them that have come are skilled people.
Yeah, no. And I think that's one thing that we also have to remember, that, asylum seekers and refugee claimants are not people who do not come without skills and without something to offer. And I think sometimes it's easy to just kind of paint everybody with the same brush.
Yeah. I know that they look desperate sitting on the sidewalk outside 129 Peter, but it takes a certain amount of skill. You have to have a certain amount of capacity in your home country to put together the wherewithal to get out. Yeah. And so we know that they're coming here ready to work. Yeah. And we have such a diverse set of labor situations and professional situations. We can definitely employ these people. But if they slide into the life you live in homelessness and they're there for 6 months, it's very difficult to now be ready for prime time,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's all these little factors. Like, I even think about our Toronto Public Library system and having a hack. And those computers are lifelines for people who may not have their own laptop and that, like, the access to the internet and to be able to do stuff, or after school programs for kids who may not have those. Yeah. I mean, I think about all the different pieces that need, that play a role in making someone's life better in Toronto.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, think about it. For a lot of people, you hand your kid a phone and you send them off to school and they're part of your data plan.
Yeah.
None of these kids have data. All the kids that their parents have just got here and they're scraping it together. The cost of data in this country, they're floating around without it. And so we're creating a great divide right off the bat. Yeah. And so wherever we can, we try and fill that gap, because you want them to experience the capacity you need to have to be on an even keel with that kid at school.
It's that equity conversation, right? Yeah. Like, and not everyone has the same tools. And it's something that's important to talk about. And I'm so glad you're here today, because what we read in the news or what we hear, it's hard to correlate that to my life. Like, like to the everyday life that someone has. And so you have been doing budget consultations.
We have 16 in the last 2 weeks.
So tell me about so let's just take a step back and say, okay, as a councillor, as the chief budget,
yes, they're calling me chief again. I'm the chair of the budget committee. Chief is a nickname. They have a chief financial officer, and then they call the chair of the budget committee chief. Although someone made the observation recently, we stopped calling it chief when you left. Now that you're back, they're saying chief again. Maybe I'm overbearing.
No, you're amazing. You're amazing.
Yeah.
What are you hearing in your consultations?
Everything. It is such an eye opener, because the first observation is you start to realize the things that maybe you haven't communicated well, because you sit down at a table and you think, oh, these people don't understand. Well, that's my bad. If they don't understand, I haven't explained it the right way. I haven't got it out there the right way. That's why, forums like this are so important, because, people work in sound bites and an X post and that sort of thing, and don't get the deep understanding of things. And so we've been using those consultations to really spell out the situation. That's what's great about a pre-budget consultation. Without the budget before you and a specific thing to react to, we can really have a conversation about what is the challenge walking into this budget process?
Right.
Well, how did we get to a $1.5 billion shortfall at the start of this process? How did that happen? Whose fault is it? And then, okay, so it is going to be a tough time. Even with the provincial New Deal, it's going to be a tough time. So what do you think? Where do you think we need to invest and be spending for impact? And what could you live without? And that's the toughest question. They start to realize that the places where they think we should just cut something and save a whole lot of money, they start to realize the financial structure and realize, well, you actually can't cut that.
Yeah.
And it's a real dilemma. Yeah. But they're sharing it with us now.
So who's the they? How do people become involved in a pre-budget consultation?
We made a really concerted effort to make sure we were reaching out everywhere. So we went across every social media platform. We got great help from people like CP24, standing at the first one and telling people how many more and putting up slides. So television, radio. We also reached out to civil society, all the NGOs in town, and said, get this word out to people that you talk to about the types of things that the city delivers. And so we started in Scarborough, went all the way across the town until we were at Rexdale. And we did an interesting thing. We did virtual and in-person sessions. And in each case, we did 2 sessions a night, did 2 90-minute back-to-back sessions. So we really, if you're a person who's already home and has time, then come to the early one. But we had sessions starting at 8:30 at night. So put the kids to bed and come on over, or put the kids to bed and log on.
I love that thought. People don't even realize the thought that goes behind it. And it feels like such a foreign process. And something that is so important is how do we get more civic engagement? And that means the average person is welcome to that.
Yeah. And it brought in people having that second session, especially virtually. It brought in people who ordinarily would say, I just don't have time. I can't do this.
Yeah.
And so we started to see people showing up in the virtual sessions who said, I've never done this before. This was an amazing conversation. And so we're really optimistic now about the actual budget consultation. We'll launch in January, and there are all these people out there from the 16 different sessions who will, be predisposed to have a good long look at what we've done. And how did you use the New Deal? How did it fit into this? Just explaining my first part of the presentation is explaining what's the difference between operating and capital.
So let's do that. Talk about the difference between operating and capital.
Well, I would say to people, operating is the things we do, and capital is the things we build. So for instance, I would always give the explanation that childcare is a sort of a human thing that people really understand. It's great to say we need more childcare centers, but an operating budget is putting the early childhood educator in there, and a manager, and a cleaner, and then you got to feed them. And these are all things that go up in cost each year, especially food right now. And childcare food is one of our biggest programs. And so those and providing enough dollars to the operators for the subsidized spaces is the operating budget. We take in all the property taxes, an operating budget for every division, and then we try and shift some cash over to the capital budget, where we can have debt, we can have cash, and we have a lot of development charges that go into the deep infrastructure stuff. But that's the only place we can have debt. The thing to remember tonight, I would say to people at all these, is every year on the operating side, revenue has to equal expenditures at the end of the day. And so these services are hard to maintain when the revenue isn't growing with the economy. Property tax is kind of a flat thing. And so they right off the bat think, oh, okay, this is going to be hard tonight. I'm going to work here. It is hard. And I said, and then the CFO went on to explain to them, okay, we're starting from a hole of $1.5 billion, because this is the year we are not going to hold out and say, these are our COVID expenses. And so here's our budget plus the COVID gap. We're loading those gaps into the budgets and saying, we're just going to have to resolve this.
Wow.
And so the books look like what the heck happened in 2023, but it's honest accounting now. And we want to honestly balance. We don't want to say the budget is balanced, except we're expecting this from this government and that government.
Right.
We want to be able to say it's here. And that's why it's so important now to resolve the issue, this shelter expense crisis, because we want an honest set of books. I think governments deserve them, but more than anything, the residents who are paying for it deserve it. I want a good, honest set of books. We're moving beyond COVID. And this is where we are at the end of that 3-year ordeal.
And I just appreciate that, because the impact of COVID, all the supports that the city and the province and the feds did to support its citizens meant people they emptied their coffers, and now we need to rebuild it. And making that connection with TTC, we have people who are working from home and not using the TTC. And when we talk about having a revenue, that was a big part of the Toronto revenue stream. Right?
Oh, huge part. Yeah.
So what happens now when people aren't using it as frequently? People don't need to buy a monthly pass because they're only going a few times a week.
Yeah.
What happens? And so I think making that connection of, if I'm not using the TTC, that every time I pay for a fare, that's actually helping pay for other things in the city.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And then the other piece, the property tax piece that you mentioned, I think there's always a conversation about, we as homeowners are paying property taxes, and what are we getting out of it? And what about all the people who are coming from outside of the city using our services?
Yeah. Our daytime economy, we call them. Yeah. Well, the province is still working on their goal of a regional transportation system. So we're starting to work out the fare integration, get those people onto the TTC, and they'll pay the difference so that we can discount the second fare that you pay moving into the core. But getting them into the core, the 5 days a week thing might never come back all the way, which means we got to relook at that fare structure. We had a monthly fare pass that we were really pressing on to try and fund the TTC. We're missing the kind of ongoing operating support that major transit systems have everywhere else in North America. And so we were really trying to lean on that Metro Pass. So the multiplier was, to buy one, you had to take 49 trips a month.
Yeah.
And we have to look at that again. Okay, so if people aren't even coming in 5 days a week, clearly that is not doable. But what is? How do we craft this to work with the new world of work so it's still an incentive that says, come in 4 days a week? I've been meeting with businesses in my role as the mayor's economic development champion for months. And they like to tell me that they can't get people to come back to work. You got to make that system safer. They're not traveling because it's safer. Well, here's an interesting fact. Ridership is beyond pre-COVID levels on Saturdays. So people are not afraid of the safety of the TTC when they're done work.
That's an interesting fact.
What's going on here? I think people just love some work from home in their routine. So if workplaces are crafting a new type of work, is it 4 days a week? Is it 3 days a week? We need to move with that and figure out what is our new fare structure. So we're really going to be pushing the TTC. They got to figure that out in 2024 because we're moving on now. We got to figure out something viable. But the fact that we still haven't gone back to that thing we had all the way up till 1995 of a regular, ongoing, predictable operating amount coming from the province is the reason that when COVID began, we were in deep, deep trouble 3 days in. because the fare box disappeared except for a few nurses and first responders. In Montreal, they said, gee, how long is this going to last? About 4 weeks in. That's because they continued to get their operating infusion from the province of Quebec. The Vancouver system continued to get its operating infusion from BC. Likewise, every city with a major system in the United States. That's a key piece that we're missing. And the reason
the key piece being having the provincial government helping
having some support for the transit come for the operating budget from income tax. Because let's face it, a transit system is an economic driver.
Yeah.
And we're funding it with fees and taxes that have nothing to do with income. And so the economy is not contributing to the transit system.
Wow, that's a big differentiator for what Toronto has to go through.
Yeah.
So just speaking about TTC, we think about the lifeline left. Like, there's conversations about, line 2. Yes. Is it line 1? Line going east and west.
Yes, that's line 2.
Line 2.
Yeah.
And that the life span of it is coming to an end.
Yeah.
And, the fear of, oh my goodness, we haven't even ordered new trains and it takes time for it. What's going to happen?
Yeah. So there is one of the most important pieces of the province's New Deal, because we've been talking about this with all of them for a long time. We have been holding between our debt and cash savings, we have been holding the ability in our own books to proceed with the order of 55 subway cars since they first said we're going to have a Scarborough subway and it's just going to be an expansion of line 2. Great piece of design. Now there's not a mode change. You get to Kennedy and you just keep going. Great. Love the new alignment, Mr. Premier. But we're not going to be able to operate it when the time comes unless we put in automated signal control for line 2, such as we have on Yonge Street, where we can run more trains faster. Yeah. We're going to need that on line 2 to run a long line. And we need new cars, 55 at a minimum. Well, that is, to me, the biggest part of the New Deal. The province's money is now on the table. We need the federal government to come in. They need to, at the very least, guarantee their funding is coming and give us a calendar date. And now we can place the order. And so that is imminent. But, it's one of the things that is touted in the New Deal. It says this deal is worth $9 billion. Well, a lot of the money that we're talking about is over there for ordering subway cars, maintaining a highway. That's all that stuff we build and repair. Highways, transit vehicles, car houses to put the transit
capital
in. So it's a great big number, but it has nothing to do with the $1.5 billion shortfall over here in operating.
Okay, right.
So it gets really tough, and that's why having those 16 opportunities to try and explain that to the community, because they hear these big numbers and they think, why isn't the amount of money coming out of my checking account for my property tax bill enough?
Yeah.
And so we really broke it down. And so I think if we do that, if we were to do that every year, we're going to over time start to have a much more participatory budget exercise in this city where people really understand who's doing what and where's the best place to fund things.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, I think just explaining, and even 16 opportunities that's in depth is not enough, right? Yeah. When you think about how large our city is and how everyone is impacted by it. But I love, you are all about participatory engagement.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, so you, Shelley Carroll, as the councillor for Don Valley North, right? Mm-hmm. I love all the campaigns that you do. Help us name. We've got this money. What do we want to do with it? Yeah. Tell me about how you are finding with your constituents, of engaging your constituents.
We love doing that. We don't have a participatory budgeting campaign in the city with tax dollars, but I know the benefit of it. I've actually traveled to see the benefit of it, and so what I do is whenever I have a development that is giving community benefit, I hive some of it off and go into a community and say, okay, there's $500,000 on the table when they build this building. How shall we spend it? The beauty of it, that's a small amount of money. And they're small projects in the end, but dealing in that sort of micro amount, people learn why things cost what they cost, why they take the amount of time they take, who has to be involved to make this a viable project. They learn all of the things that staff have to go through. And what happens is their own expectations of what can happen and their ideas start to be geared to realities.
Yeah.
And before you know it, you're getting great ideas. And they're still pushing. I want more than you're telling me I can have. Here's an idea you never thought of, Councillor. But now they're learning more about how are we going to get this. In cities where they do this every year and they do it with tax dollars, they're well beyond us. New York City, the wards that have done this all along, they're at a level of sophistication now where when they brainstorm for ideas, sometimes the ideas are, I would like to take, of the $1 million we're dealing with, I would like to reserve $250,000 a year every year because I want to spend a whole $1 million and I know that it won't be voted on. So let's set up a participatory reserve account to do big things. That's a level of sophistication.
That is.
That's them really understanding how our staff to do some things have to plan it out over 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely.
And they're now doing it themselves that way. So it's a real engagement in your city that I think gives people so much power to really understand how things are done. Now I have the power to be part of the reason it gets done.
And I love that because oftentimes, even when I speak to people, they're like, well, we plan to build a subway. Oh, new government comes in. Oh, we're filling it up. And it's like good money after bad, like, you know, and people are like, what? We just wasted all that money and we can't plan for long-term things. And so how do we get good governance and accountability and to be able to plan? Like when you know, we need 55 carts, you know, 20 years from now, and you plan for that as a budget, it's not, surprise, you can get ahead of it and prepare for delays, prepare for shortcomings or anything like that. But churning a budget around, a deficit of 1.5 billion, like how do you materialize that? Like when you think about small businesses, they need to plan ahead as well.
Exactly. And I think we'd get a more rational discussion about what transit line next if people knew what's involved, if they knew that we want to place that order right now because we're a good 5 years away from the Scarborough subway being ready to run. But to build 55 cars, you actually have to place the order now and get started. And you don't pay for it all at once at the end. In order for that assembly line to work, you're going to send that money in tranches so that you're actually paying for those. You know, I don't know if they'll be built in Thunder Bay. I don't know who's building them, but a lot of our transit vehicles do get built there in the Alstom line. You're now creating jobs all over Ontario. And so you want to plan in that long-term way. And you know that saying, yes, let's build this transit line, you're also driving the economy.
Absolutely.
Those good jobs are happening all over the province. Once they're done, we'll run them. But who's making our parts? Someone else in Ontario. And so they start to know you got a long-term plan. And you can't just say, I want this line here. You got to be able to afford the vehicles. You got to really take the time to understand why choose this line here or that line there. Why the sequence on the Move Ontario plan. Yeah. Why is it being built in the sequence it's being built in? Where's the tunnel bore from one time to the next? We kind of leave that discussion to intense transit nerds.
Yeah. And we love them.
I think that to have a really good transit conversation, what we've got to do is be able to simplify that conversation. I'm a nerd myself. I could dive into that forever. But we also need to de-nerdify it and simplify it.
Right.
What's the rationale for why this station will be here? What's the rationale for why we need the money now when they're not going to be finished for another 7 years? So that people just have a base understanding and they're not just back of the napkin saying, I want this to be a subway, not a busway, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I mean, even when we think about Metrolinx, the Eglinton line, even when we talk about Scarborough and the RT closing down earlier, and now the bus routes, they're not quite adequate, right? It impacts the people in Scarborough.
Well, I'm optimistic about the bus routes that are in play now. People are on the very first week, people are saying, "Oh, this isn't going to work," but I think they've got to give the TTC a little bit of time, because in fact, they have in record time put together all these rapid TO lines. People got up one morning and got on Kennedy and thought, what the heck is that over there? Saw this red painted line that was done overnight on the weekend. And so getting that flow right and making sure they have the right buses out of the spare inventory and out on the road is going to take a couple of weeks. But I think people are going to get used to the network soon enough. The thing is, when you hear the complaints, if you're a councillor who isn't near Scarborough or ever in it, I'm constantly in it because I drive my grandsons all over it for basketball. But the councillors on the West End and Central, they may get the same complaints as everyone else and think, oh, well, we failed. We completely failed.
Right. Okay,
hold on a sec. There's a ton of infrastructure out there. Let's give it a couple of weeks to breathe and see how it works. TTC right now to try and keep the budget the way it is, they wait and see. Okay, send another bus out. Okay, oh, we need one here. So you got to give them a couple of weeks to really get the flow, and then I think we'll be there. If they haven't got enough buses to flow to those red lines, then we're going to have to address that. And there have been extreme times where we actually ended up borrowing fleet to get there. But I think
from where?
We'll get there. Well, sometimes in the spare inventory of other transit systems,
yes,
you can borrow fleet. So
wow,
and when you're up at close to the city limits, it's so unusual to see a YRT bus coming down.
That's true.
They come right into Don Mills Road, but they may actually be picking up capacity up there, so that down further into the city, you've got more Toronto buses focused there.
I totally didn't know that.
Yeah. So we're going to do what we can to make sure it works. And we also have buses coming in, because we're still, one thing that the federal government has been helpful with is greening our fleet. So we still have some hydro buses coming in.
Yeah, those are cool when you see them that are on electric and everything, that are emission free. Okay, so the New Deal, I mean, everyone's talking about it. What are like the top 3 things that we should be aware of?
Well, the good news for people is we've just been talking about transit. There's money on the table for transit. There is some money in the operating. Of the $1.5 billion, about $450 million is taken care of in the deal. Some of that is going to the transit system, and with the strings attached. The premier was very clear that he wants to spend some of that on the safety and security on the system.
Yes.
And that works for us because the TTC budget has increased security in it. Some of those safety officers, not constables, but we have these community safety officers that have been, sort of wardening the system and helping us with some of the social service needs, people seeking refuge and things like that. Those were increased in the 2024 budget anyway. So now we have a funding source for that. And we can also use some to fill that ridership gap. So it replaces some of that draw on the property tax that's kind of killing us right now. So that's good news. The other thing is the shelter money they put on the table. Okay. So the mayor is spending every day going from person to person to person in the federal government and trying to get us there. They really need to find it. We can't wait till May.
No.
That transit system runs in real time. That shelter system runs in real time. So we really need them to come to the table on that. And they're not hanging up the phone. They're having the conversations. So it's good. But we still are going to have very tight budgets. So we're asking people to flatline, and in most of our services, they've been flatlining as best they can for a long time now. And because we were sort of keeping property taxes artificially low. We were like below inflation.
We haven't had a property assessment increase since 2016.
Oh, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Yes. We haven't done an assessment for a long time. Gosh, should I even say this on the air? I attended a conversation of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario where they talked about whether or not they should go harder on a campaign to make the province do an assessment. And what became clear to me just observing the conversation is there are a lot of councillors across this province who don't know how the current value assessment system works.
Right. Yeah, it's complicated.
They thought that because their property values have gone up in their city, that everyone would have a 20% increase just through assessment. That's not how it works. So you do the assessment, but if they've all gone up, they then set a cap and adjust it back down so that doesn't happen. That's one of the reasons that municipalities across the province have an artificially low base property tax. And the only way we can adjust that while we're waiting for the next assessment is increases at budget time. It's designed in a way that if the taxes go up, it's definitely the municipal government's fault and not ours.
Right.
But it is really hurting. It's especially hurting businesses that we're not looking at commercial properties and their change of value. Because the last time we did an assessment, they were doing very well and they were kind of geared artificially high. And that is a whole new universe post-pandemic, as you would know in your day job. And so they really would commercial properties would really like to see a reassessment done. The province is reviewing it, but we maintain if they're reviewing the whole system and maybe proposing a whole new system, they should take their time with that and do a really good review.
No, for sure.
And if that's the case, take 3 years, do an assessment for us, and then take your time on the review. But that's not what's going on. Currently, they've said, no, thank you. We're not going to do an assessment. And so we're in the realm now of if it's another couple of years, it's going to kind of be a shock to the system when they finally do one. Whatever changes they've made, it will be kind of like when we first got current value assessment, and it was mind-blowing in some neighborhoods and a real economic impact. And so it's going to be very tricky when they finally get down to doing it, how they manipulate it, not to create economic devastation. But in the meantime, we're stuck with this artificially low assessment, and it means you will start to see right across the province the increases that municipalities have to do are going to get larger. Some of the smaller municipalities have already previewed their budgets, and they're talking about things like 14%. We don't really have any choice if we're not going to do an assessment.
No. And I talk to my clients about that, right? When we're buying residential properties or commercial. And I'm like, okay, well, just FYI, we haven't had a municipal tax increase for a long time. So you need to be prepared that it'll be coming, I don't know when, but it should be something you're aware of.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. You don't want to look at something and say, I could just about handle that bill. You have to know that there will be an adjustment to it sometime.
Yeah. And that's can be terrifying in the realm that we're in right now.
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing about that. Now, I just want to take a moment. As a long-standing councillor, you have done some amazing things. And a question I know you probably get asked is, what was your pathway? How did you get there?
Oh.
Tell us a little bit about that because...
Well, I used to make a joke that I can't make it. If I was ever asked to meet with young women wanting to get into politics, I would make the joke, well, I owe my entire political career to Mike Harris. But that doesn't work anymore because they sort of barely remember who he is, don't understand political alignment. And so it doesn't work as a joke. It falls flat.
Yeah.
But I really do. I had no intention of getting into politics. I came in, as many do, in the municipal realm through the school board. But I was really inspired to run because I was having to become more and more of an activist as education reforms were really clearly not going to serve my kids. Both my kids had special needs going through education, one with autism. And I thought, boy, we're sunk. I'm going to have to get way more involved. And very quickly, if you really look, you realize I can't just march through screaming and yelling for just Susan and Martha. I need to make global change here. That will serve them. And, I used the same calculus. Someone said there's an opening, you got to run for City Hall. And I used the same calculus. Okay, what can you achieve at City Hall? You actually get yourself into an arena where you can create a more compassionate city. And boy, that would serve Martha.
Yeah.
and so when that opportunity came up, I moved into that and have been very involved in politics beyond just my council seat since. But it's an interesting path because I didn't even finish my post-secondary. When we moved to Toronto, it was important to get my husband situated in the film and television industry. Yeah. So I just started working in the bank and educating myself through educational opportunities the bank was offering in accounting, and kept going. And so when I quit the bank to stay home because of my daughter's special needs, I thought I'm going to take a few years at home. I got to a level in the bank I could probably go back. So I'll do this. And it was during the time I was at home that Mike Harris got elected. And I thought, well, this is going to go well for my kids.
Yeah. And then
because they right away were doing radical reform of education system. And I can remember driving in a car and we were going through the family devastation of realizing, okay, what's happening with this kid? She's not meeting any of the milestones. She's 5 years old and we're still struggling with potty training at that point. And I'm driving along and Mike Harris is on a radio station. He's on like the youth station where they were playing alternative and punk music. And so he's just joking with the morning jocks. And he said something about, you got a lot of plans for the school system. And he said, yeah. And I thought that kid, that disc jockey must have a kid with special needs. He said, you said something about special ed yesterday. And Mike said, yeah, there's a real scam out there. It's in fashion to identify kids. Most of them are fake identified. And I thought, okay, I'm in trouble.
Oh, no.
We're in really big trouble.
Yeah.
And I joined the North York Citywide Parent Assembly pretty much that weekend and started to work. And so I started at that moment and just kept following my path. Yeah.
Well, you have been such a long-standing counselor who has demonstrated an openness to listen to people and enact and to stand up when others weren't courageous enough to stand up. And I think when we talk about leadership, and that's a question I always ask people is like, where do you find that courage?
I've had a lot of courageous women around me for a long time. Starting that, it was the North York Parent Assembly said we got to send some of our best parents down. We're going to have a conversation with all the municipalities. And across the room was this woman giving John Snowball a hard time and saying, what's being done with our sign-in sheet? We'd like a copy of it. We want to keep meeting just as parents. And they were like, you can't have our sign-up sheet. And this woman stood up and said, if you're okay with me having your sign-in sheet information, raise your hand. And we all raised our hands. That was Kathleen Wynne. I thought, are you allowed to do that? Do people do that downtown? I used to live downtown. I didn't do that. Wow, you're allowed to make a fuss. And so, that was a real inspiration. There was another woman there from the parent group, and she was there with the equity officer from the Toronto board, Lloyd McKell. Rest in peace, Lloyd. Huge influence on me. And one of the parents was standing with him, and that was Annie Kidder.
Wow.
And so there were just some extraordinary women at that moment in time that were all floating around the system. And Adrian Heaps, who became a councillor from Scarborough, was the only dad in the room, but he was a force to be reckoned with for them. Janice Etter from Etobicoke. It was just an amazing group. And one of the things that Kathleen said to me was, if they're going to do anything, I'm also in touch with John Sewell a lot, so I'm keeping track of what they might have proposed for the city. And so even while I was focused on the school board, I ended up down at Citizens for Local Democracy meetings every Monday night and starting to learn really the whole activist community, the people paying attention. And for me, it was right away, oh, these are my peeps. I've been wondering where you all were.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
I love this story. Well,
yeah.
I mean, okay. I always love to bring the conversation to a close with a fun quote, an inspirational quote, right? And you shared with me this quote. If people have split views about your work, I think it's flattering. I'd rather have them feel something about it than dismiss it. Stephen Sondheim.
Yes, I love that. And I love that it comes from a musician.
Yeah.
But it's true everywhere in life. It's really true everywhere in life. If you walk into a room and everybody likes you, you're not going to produce anything tonight.
Yeah.
Everybody loves you. How can you make change? You're all just going to sit around and be pleasant together, or you're all going to sit around and awfulize together. Isn't everyone outside this room awful? But if you can pull people into a room, I've been sitting at tables across the city where there's someone saying, stop building bike lanes. We need more parking and less biking in this city. And across from him is someone who is sunk if they can't use a bike to commute.
Yeah.
And they have to talk at the same table.
I love that.
That's real. That's real. And it's true in the creative world. You want somebody to be mad at your play. And I want somebody to be mad at my ideas and really test me. Why in the hell did you do that, Shelley? Well, I got to tell you why now. And I got to really have conviction with it. Yeah.
Well, you have always, as I observe and watch you do the work that you do, you're always, shaking things up and challenging others, but also challenging yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that is probably a part of the secret recipe, right? For
I think so.
Invoking creative change.
Yeah. You should not, this job should not be about developing the best golf swing.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for joining me today. I really appreciate the time and for sharing your knowledge and experience about the budget and the New Deal. Oh, wait, before we close.
What's that?
Sales tax.
Oh.
Is Toronto going to get a sales tax?
It's a matter of time. It's a matter of time. We are now the largest city in the world that doesn't have one. And that's a fact. That's a fact.
So people better get onto this pre-consultation meetings.
Yeah. We're not going to get it this year. The province was very clear that that's not a function of this year's conversation about a new deal, but they agree that we need to keep on talking about every tool that's in our long-term financial plan document. And that's top of the list. It's so straightforward. It's a simple matter of, if you don't have any money to buy your kids a pair of shoes on the first day of school, I'm not going to get any money from you. If you can buy $100 pair of shoes, you can afford Air Force Lows, you're going to throw $13 when you spend that $100. You're going to throw $13 at the province and the feds. We're just saying throw in one extra buck for the city. But lots of people in this city bought a $600 pair of shoes for their spoiled kid for the first day of school. I have no way to get their money. Really none. There are people who got richer as a result of COVID because they were invested in tech. I have no access to those dollars to run this city. And people think we do have that access. We don't. Sales tax gives the city that small portion. In the United States, virtually every major city has at least a 0.5 or a 1% sales tax. Some have like 2%.
Well, Niagara Falls has a tourism sales tax.
Yeah. We have the municipal accommodation tax on hotels, but just a 1 cent sales tax, throw in that extra dollar for the city on $100, that would be $1 billion a year.
Wow.
So think of our shortfall. Think of how far behind we are on catching up with transit, catching up with some of these things. We'd still need to have a healthy partnership conversation with the other orders of government, but it really would take us off their backs on that day-to-day, please help us basis.
Wow. Thank you. That's sound. Thank you for your time.
You bet.
Thanks for checking out this episode. You want to make sure to like, subscribe, and share so that you don't miss out on the next In Focus episode on topics that matter to you.